So now what do you have? Now, if you used an NG tube to decompress the stomach first, you would have the stomach decompressed. If you remove the NG tube at that point and then put the guide tube, the blocker tube in, you'll have a balloon in the upper part of the esophagus blocking off the esophagus. You'll have the airQ airway mask itself blocking off the esophagus. So you have a dual stage blocking of the esophagus, and you have a multi-orifice port distal to the balloon that's venting the esophagus, and you have the ability to suck out the upper part of the esophagus distal to the balloon to decrease the pressure if the patient starts to regurgitate. Now, the reason that I like the blocker tube, and why I put it in usually after the insertion of an NG tube, is because I call it my early warning system. Not only can you decompress the upper esophagus using the suction port for suction, but if you get regurgitated up that tube, it tells me that the patient is passively aspirating, assuming that he hasn't had a full-blown vomit situation. It tells me that the patient is regurgitating, that it's getting behind the balloon, and it's going up my vent tube. When I see that, it tells me that it's time to put an endotracheal tube in the patient. What makes the blocker airway and blocker tube unique is that it allows you to put an endotracheal tube in the patient using the airQ as an airway conduit, intubation conduit, and not taking out the protection distally that is blocking off and venting the esophagus. All the other devices that are on the market, you have to take the device out to put the endotracheal tube in. And when you make that transformation, you remove your protection, and there's very high likelihood that the patient's going to aspirate at some point or another during that transformation. Now, it is possible to put an endotracheal tube in devices that are already in, but it's extraordinarily difficult to do this. With airQ, it's very, very easy. Now, to show you how to use the airQ as an intubation conduit, you have to hold the airQ in the upper part of the airQ and remove this connector. Now, the connector will stay on for you in case you need to use it again. What that'll do is open up the airQ breathing tube to put large bore endotracheal tubes through. Now, the next thing you want to do is you want to use a standard endotracheal tube. Now, you want to take the endotracheal tube and you want to suck all the air out. And usually I roll it up into a ball like this. I usually put the tip in here for a little bit to give it a little extra curve, because when the endotracheal tube goes into the airQ curved tube, it's going to want to go up into the trachea. And so if you curve it up a little bit, it goes in a little easier. That's just a little trick that I've learned. Next, you want to put some lubrication on the distal part of the endotracheal tube, rub it around a little bit. Now, on the side of the blocker airway tube, you'll notice a couple arrows and a number on the upper part near the connector. That tells you the distance from the outside of the airway breathing tube to the opening on the inside of the mask bowl. Now, why would I want to know that? Because I'm going to use the endotracheal tube to lubricate the inside of the breathing tube of the airQ during the intubation. So on the 3.5, you'll notice that number is 18 centimeters. So I'm going to grab the endotracheal tube at around 18 and hold it firmly while I pass the lubricated endotracheal tube down the barrel and run it up and down and twist it back, running my fingers all the way down to 18. That's going to ensure that I lubricate the airQ internal part of the breathing tube through and through instead of just part of the way through. It's extraordinarily important that you lubricate it well, otherwise the tube might get stuck on its passage through the airQ. So if you lubricate it really well, twisting a little bit, using your fingers as a stop, it only takes a couple seconds to lubricate the airQ. Usually at that point, I try one blind intubation. So I lubricate it well, I tilt the head back in extension, and I pass the endotracheal tube into the trachea. Now I had to push a little bit on the cricoid there, get the endotracheal tube around the corner. Typically in patients you don't have to do that. That's my mannequin. Now, as you notice, the airQ and endotracheal tube went right into the trachea of this mannequin on the first attempt. If the patient is in the intubation position, if it's in upper extended position, the airQ will allow the endotracheal tube to go in the trachea about 70% of the time on one pass. Now, you don't need a lot of skill to do this. It's automatic. The airQ will do all the work for you. All you have to do is pass the endotracheal tube forward and it goes into the trachea. The next thing you want to do is make sure the endotracheal tube went into the trachea, because if it misses, it goes into the esophagus. There's only two places it can go. It either has to go into the trachea or it has to go into the esophagus. how I do that is once I've got the endotracheal tube all the way in, I push it all the way into the connector. Then I air up the cuff of the endotracheal tube. I put my stethoscope over the stomach. I squeeze the bag just a little bit, and I listen to the stomach for breath sounds. If I hear bubbles in the stomach, then I know it went into the esophagus. But if I don't hear any bubbles, I move my stethoscope up to the lungs, listen for breath sounds, and if I'm lucky enough to have an end-tidal CO2 monitor, I'll check the end-tidal CO2. This is how I very quickly determine whether the endotracheal tube went into the esophagus or whether it went into the trachea. Now, if we're unlucky and the endotracheal tube does not go into the trachea, it goes into the esophagus instead, I just take the air out of the endotracheal tube and I back it back up to that number 18 centimeters again so that the endotracheal tube is right at the distal tip of the airway device.